His name was Joachim Peiper. He was 30 years old in December of 1944. Lean, decorated, precise. His commanding officers called him the best young officer in the SS. His men called him something else. They called him Blowtorch. On the morning of December 17th, 1944, in a snow-covered field outside a small Belgian town called Malmedy, soldiers under his direct command lined up 84 American prisoners of war. Their hands were up. These are not combat soldiers. They were surveyors, forward observers, truck drivers. Most of them had never been in a firefight. They were 20 years old, some younger. The German soldiers opened fire with machine guns. Some men died instantly. Others fell into the snow and lay perfectly still, eyes open, breathing as shallowly as they could while German soldiers moved through the field firing single shots into the bodies around them. 43 men survived by playing dead. They crawled to ditches, hid under the bodies of their friends, ran broken and bleeding into the tree lane. They would spend the rest of their lives making sure the world knew exactly what happened in that field. Joachim Peiper was tried for those murders at Nuremberg, sentenced to death. And then they let him go. He moved to a quiet house in rural France. He got a dog. He took long walks in the woods. He worked as a translator for a publisher. His neighbors knew who he was. He lived there for nearly 20 years. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest, bloodiest battle the United States Army has ever fought. But is also the story of what happens when the war ends and justice does not follow. And it is the story of what happens when the men who remember decide they have waited long enough. To understand Joachim Peiper, you have to understand what the German military machine had done to him and what he had done for it. He was born in Berlin in 1915. His father was an army officer. By the time Peiper was 23, he had joined the SS and become the personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. Think about that. 23 years old, sitting next to Himmler, reading his correspondence, managing his schedule, learning exactly how power worked inside Nazi Germany from the inside. He was good at everything the SS valued. Disciplined, fearless, completely loyal to National Socialist ideology. He was not a reluctant soldier forced into uniform. He believed. By 1944, Peiper had fought on the Eastern Front through some of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. He had received the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration, multiple times. His units had destroyed more Soviet tanks than almost any comparable force in the Wehrmacht. But his units were also accused of something else. On the Eastern Front, Peiper's men had been linked to the killing of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, village burnings, mass executions, the kinds of acts that were quietly tolerated, even encouraged in the Nazi war in the East, where official policy held that Slavic people were subhuman and the rules of war did not apply. Peiper brought that mentality west with him, and the men above him knew it. That is exactly why they chose him. By December 1944, the war in Europe looked, to most observers, nearly over. D-Day had succeeded in June. Paris was liberated in August. The Allies were pushing toward the German border from the west. The Soviets were grinding toward it from the east. American generals were planning Christmas parties. Some were openly betting on a surrender date. The mood at Allied headquarters was not caution. It was confidence, almost celebration. They were wrong. Deep inside Germany, Adolf Hitler had a plan. His generals thought it was insane. Several tried to talk him out of it. He had already survived the bomb assassination attempt in July, the famous Wolf's Lair plot, and emerged more certain than ever that he alone could see what others could not. His plan was called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. For months, in absolute secrecy, the Germans had been massing an entire army in the forests along the Belgian border. 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces. All of it moved at night, under radio silence, hidden beneath the tree canopy from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The target, the Ardennes forest. Dense, hilly, fog-covered terrain that the Allies had deliberately thinned out, rotating exhausted divisions there to rest, confident that nothing significant could happen in such difficult country. In some sectors, a single American division was holding a front 85 miles wide. Hitler's objective: punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the critical port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. If he could do that, if he could manufacture a crisis large enough, he believed Britain and America would negotiate a separate peace. Germany could then turn everything it had left against the Soviets. He had to choose: accept the inevitable defeat or gamble everything he had left on one final offensive. He chose to gamble, and for the Spearhead, the fastest, most aggressive armored column, the one that had to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours, or the entire operation would fail, he chose Joachim Peiper. The attack began on December 16th, 1944, before dawn. 4 in the morning. Temperature well below freezing. American soldiers in their foxholes heard something strange, a low, rolling rumble building from the east. Then the German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front, all at once. The men who survived described it as the ground shaking. Not in one place, everywhere. The sound, they said, of the world ending. Within hours, the American front line had collapsed in multiple places. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Commanders had no picture of what was happening. Soldiers were cut off, surrounded, or simply overwhelmed before they could even understand what they were facing. The Allies had been caught almost completely off guard. There was one exception. At a crossroads near the tiny Belgian village of Lanzerath, a 19-year-old private named Lloyd Lochner was in a foxhole with 18 other men. They were a small intelligence-gathering unit, not frontline infantry. No tanks, limited ammunition, no fortifications worth the name. Coming through the morning fog directly at them, an entire German regiment. Over 500 soldiers, artillery support, half-tracks. Lochner and his 18 men made a decision. They stayed, 18 Americans against 500 Germans, in the snow and the fog, with nothing but rifles and the discipline not to run. They held that crossroads for nearly the entire first day. Their resistance delayed the panzer column behind that regiment, a column that was supposed to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours. That column would be held up for over a week. Lochner and most of his men were eventually captured. They survived the war. Almost no one knows their names. That is the thing about the Battle of the Bulge. The men who changed the outcome are mostly forgotten. The generals get the statues. The ordinary soldiers get the silence. Back at Allied headquarters, the picture was becoming terrifying. This was not a raid, not a local counterattack. 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks, moving fast, moving deep, moving through a front line that was already buckling. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting on December 19th in a cold, barely heated room in the French city of Verdun, the same city that had been the site of the deadliest battle of the First World War. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in that room. Eisenhower looked at his commanders and said something that very few military leaders say in the middle of a crisis. The present situation, he said, is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. Most of the generals in the room were not convinced. Then Eisenhower turned to George Patton, commander of 3rd Army, the most aggressive battlefield commander the Americans had. He asked, how long to disengage 3rd Army from its current position, turn it 90 degrees north, and relieve the surrounded city of Bastogne? Every other general went quiet, turning an entire army in winter conditions, repositioning hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, supply chains, artillery units. Normally requires weeks of planning. Minimum. Patton didn't hesitate. 48 hours, he said. Silence. What nobody in that room knew, what Patton had not told anyone, was that he had already given the order. That morning, before the meeting started, he had quietly directed his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans covering every scenario Eisenhower might present. The movement was already underway before Patton sat down. George Patton had walked into that meeting already executing the plan he was about to be asked to make. Then something happened that no meteorologist had predicted, and that changed everything. Let's go back to Peiper. December 17th, day 2 of the German offensive. Kampfgruppe Peiper was pushing through the Belgian countryside. 4,800 men, 600 vehicles, Tiger tanks, half-tracks artillery. The most powerful armored force in the entire German offensive. And Peiper was already behind schedule. The roads of the Ardennes were not built for armor. They were narrow, winding lanes designed for farmers and horse-drawn carts, not Tiger tanks weighing 57 tons. Peiper's column had already been forced off its planned route multiple times. Bridges too weak, roads too narrow for the vehicles trying to use them. He was improvising, rerouting, burning time. His orders from above were absolute. No dilas, no stops. Reach the Meuse. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, near the crossroads at Bastogne, just outside the town of Malmedy, something unexpected rolled into his path. A convoy of American trucks came down the road directly into the spearhead of the entire German offensive. They were soldiers of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, forward observers, radio operators, surveyors, men trained to watch a battlefield and call in coordinates, not to fight their way through an armored column. They had been driving to a new assignment, driving blind, with no idea the German offensive had even begun. There were about 120 of them. They were captured quickly, thoroughly. There was no fight. Peiper didn't have time for prisoners. He had a timetable. He had to reach the Meuse River. Every hour he stood still was an hour the offensive was failing. He had to make a decision. The prisoners, 120 men, were marched into an open field next to the crossroads. Some were searched. Some were given water. For a few minutes, standing in the snow with their hands up, nothing happened. Then someone opened fire. The machine gun started. The Americans had nowhere to run. The field was wide open. The snow was deep. They were surrounded on all sides. 84 men were killed, shot where they stood. Some tried to run and were cut down before they made 10 yards. Others dropped and lay completely still in the snow, forcing themselves not to breathe hard, listening to boots crunching through the field around them, to the crack of single shots being fired into bodies. 43 men survived. Some crawled to a frozen drainage ditch. Some hid under the bodies of the men next to them. Some reached the tree line and stumbled through the forest to Allied lines, bleeding, frostbitten, in shock. But they were alive, and they remembered every single detail. Word of the Malmedy massacre spread through American units within hours. It changed the nature of the fighting. Soldiers who had been retreating, disorganized, overwhelmed, suddenly had something beyond orders keeping them in place. Some units passed word through their lines, not as an official order, as a personal decision. 2 words, no surrender. Peiper continued moving. By the morning of December 18th, Peiper's column had reached the town of Stavelot. He needed to cross a bridge, and beyond that bridge was something he desperately needed: fuel. Near Stavelot, the Americans maintained one of the largest fuel reserves in all of Belgium, 124,000 gallons of gasoline. enough to keep Peiper's entire column running all the way to the Meuse River and beyond. If he got to it, the race was effectively over. The German offensive would reach its objective. A small American unit held the bridge at Stavelot. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Peiper was right there. The bridge was right there. And then something happened no one expected. The Americans blew the bridge, and they set fire to the fuel depot. 124,000 gallons of gasoline went up in a pillar of fire that could be seen for miles across the Ardennes forest. Peiper watched it burn. He found another crossing. He kept pushing, but he was now burning fuel he could never replace, from tanks he could not refill, toward an objective that was moving further out of reach with every mile. He was 20 miles from the Meuse River. He never got any closer. By December 19th, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead that was supposed to decide the entire battle, was stranded. No fuel, roads blocked by its own abandoned vehicles, the forest closing in. The entire German offensive had banked everything on this column, reaching the Meuse in 48 hours. The most powerful armored force in the German military had been stopped, not by a superior army, not by Allied air power, by an empty fuel gauge, and by the decision of a small group of American soldiers to burn what they could not defend. Those men have no monument. Most people have never heard of them. Meanwhile, 30 miles to the south at the city of Bastogne, another story was reaching its pivot point. Bastogne sat at the hub of 7 major roads through the Ardennes. Whoever held it controlled the movement of armies. The Germans needed it desperately. The Americans knew they needed it. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been rushed there in open trucks in the middle of the night in the cold. Many arrived without winter gear, some without rifles. They drove into a city that was being surrounded, and they began digging in. By December 21st, Bastogne was completely encircled. No resupply, no reinforcement, no way in or out. On December 22nd, 2 German officers came toward the American perimeter under a white flag. They carried a formal written demand for surrender, signed by the German divisional commander. It stated that if McAuliffe's garrison did not capitulate, the city would be destroyed and every man in it killed. The demand was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He read it, set it down, thought for a moment, and wrote back one single word: nuts. The German officers receiving the reply had to have it translated. When they understood what it meant, essentially, go to hell, the senior officer reportedly said, "We will kill every American in Bastogne." McAuliffe's response, according to the men in that room, was quiet, almost conversational. "I know," he said. "Let's stop here. Step away from the generals, the famous quotes, the chess game of strategy." Because the Battle of the Bulge was not a story about commanders. It was 75,000 American casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. It was the bloodiest engagement in the history of the United States Army. And the men fighting, it had almost nothing. The American military had not prepared for winter fighting. The assumption, right up until December 16th, was that the war would be over before the cold set in. So the soldiers in the Ardennes had no winter boots, no coats rated for sub-zero temperatures, no sleeping bags designed for what they were about to face. The temperature in the Ardennes that December dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Men's feet went numb inside their boots. The skin turned white, then black. Trench foot, a condition from prolonged exposure to cold and wet, claimed thousands before any German had fired shot at them. Some lost toes, some lost feet. The field hospitals were overwhelmed before the fighting reached its peak. Men were dying in their foxholes from cold alone. And yet, through the artillery, the cold, the hunger, the terror of hearing Tiger tank engines in the dark of a forest, and knowing your bazooka might not punch through the armor, the American soldier held. Not because they were ordered to, because they looked at the man in the foxhole next to them and decided they were not leaving him. That is the only decision that actually won this battle. That one, made by hundreds of thousands of individuals alone in the dark and cold. In Bastogne, the civilians did not evacuate. They couldn't. The Germans had closed the ring before most of them had any warning. So they went into their cellars. They brought their children, their food, their rosaries. They listened to artillery shake the floors and walls and roofs above their heads. And they shared their cellars with wounded American soldiers they didn't know, men who spoke a language they barely understood, men who smelled of blood and smoke and cold. Some of those families had already survived one German occupation earlier in the war. They understood, without anyone explaining it, exactly what it meant if the wrong army walked through that door. One Belgian woman, a nurse, reportedly treated both American and German wounded in the same cellar, in shifts, through 3 consecutive days of bombardment. She worked by candlelight. Her name is not in most history books. Then something happened that no one has ever adequately explained. In the town of Stavelot, which Peiper's SS troops briefly retook on December 18th before being pushed back out, German soldiers massacred the civilian population. 130 Belgian men, women, and children, killed in their homes, in their cellars, in the streets, shot in reprisal for the local population having sheltered American soldiers. The youngest victim was 18 months old. And then, on the other side of the American lines, Eisenhower did something that had never been done before in the United States Army. Desperate for infantry, he asked black soldiers, who had been confined almost exclusively to support and supply roles by military segregation, to volunteer for frontline combat duty. Thousands raised their hand. For the first time in American military history, black soldiers fought integrated into white combat units. Side by side, in the same foxholes, under the same artillery, against the same enemy. Their white commanding officers, many of whom had opposed integration on principle, wrote glowing reports on their courage, their discipline, their professionalism under fire. And when the battle was over, when the crisis had passed, the army quietly resegregated. The black soldiers were sent back to their support roles, as if nothing had changed, as if none of it had happened. The United States Army would not officially desegregate until 1948. 3 years later. Some things take longer to change than they should. On the German side of the line, the men fighting in the Ardennes were not the true believers of 1940. The diaries recovered from German soldiers killed in the battle tell a different story. We attacked because we are ordered to, one soldier wrote 3 days before he was killed. Not because we believe. He was 18 years old. Many of the men in that offensive were teenagers. 6-week veterans. Men pulled from factories, from desk jobs, from schools. The German army of December 1944 was the desperate final expenditure of a nation that had already spent its best soldiers on the Eastern Front. They knew it. Many of them said so in their letters home. They attacked anyway, because the alternative was a bullet from their own officers. On December 23, 1944, the clouds broke. For 7 days, the Ardennes had been locked in fog and heavy overcast, weather so thick that Allied aircraft simply could not fly. The Germans had planned the timing of the offensive around this weather window precisely because they knew that without air cover, the Americans were just men with rifles fighting tanks. An American chaplain named Father James O'Neill had printed 250,000 prayer cards and distributed them across the front. The card asked God for clear weather. Patton had personally requested the prayer, and when the skies cleared, publicly credited it. Whether you believe in miracles or meteorology, on December 23rd, the skies over the Ardennes opened, blue from horizon to horizon. Cold, clear, perfect flying weather. Within hours, thousands of Allied aircraft were airborne. C. 47 transport planes dropped supplies into Bastogne. Ammunition, medical equipment, food. For the first time in a week, the men of the 101st Airborne had bullets for their rifles. And the P-47 Thunderbolts, the American tank killers, went hunting. German armor that had been moving freely through the forest roads was suddenly exposed under clear winter sky. The Thunderbolts came in low and hit everything. Fuel convoys, supply columns, artillery positions, vehicle concentrations. Within 48 hours, the German supply lines behind the Ardennes were effectively destroyed. The offensive was dying. On December 26th, 10 days after the German attack had begun, Patton's lead tank rolled up to the southern perimeter of Bastogne. The men of the 101st Airborne, who had held for 10 days surrounded, outnumbered, without adequate food, ammunition, or medical supplies, in temperatures that killed men in their sleep, heard the sound of American armor on the road from the south. Some of them cried. Some couldn't speak. General McAuliffe, when the relief column's commander found him and reported in, looked at him for a moment. "It's about time," he said. Hitler ordered a second offensive in early January. It failed within days. The German army in the Ardennes was retreating now, bleeding out, running on empty. Joachim Peiper, stranded in the forest with his fuel-less column, made a decision. He abandoned his vehicles, hundreds of tanks and half-tracks, left where they sat, and retreated on foot through the forest with whatever men he had. Of the 4,800 men who had followed him into the Ardennes, roughly 800 made it back to German lines. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended January 25, 1945. 6 weeks after it began. American casualties, 75,000. The largest total of any American battle in the entire Second World War. German casualties, somewhere between 60 and 100,000. With no reserves left to draw from, no replacements, no fuel, no path to recovery. The war in Europe would be over 4 months later. But for Joachim Peiper, the war was not quite finished. The survivors of the Malmedy field had given their testimony. In detail, repeatedly, they had identified officers, described specific vehicles, named specific men, described the moment the shooting started and exactly what happened afterward. Peiper was identified, arrested, brought to trial at the Dachau war crimes trials in 1946 in what became known as the Malmedy massacre trial. 73 German soldiers convicted, 43 sentenced to death. Peiper, as the commanding officer, received the highest sentence, death by hanging, and then something happened no one expected. The sentences were commuted, one by one, and then all at once. The Cold War had changed the calculation. The United States needed West Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. West Germany needed to reintegrate its soldiers back into a functioning society. War crimes trials, trials that convicted German officers by the hundreds, were becoming politically inconvenient. Defense attorneys raised questions about interrogation methods used to obtain confessions. Evidence was challenged. One of the attorneys involved, a young senator from Wisconsin just beginning his political career, a man named Joseph McCarthy, saw political opportunity in defending German officers and took it. The death sentences became life sentences. The life sentences were reduced. The reductions continued. Year by year, man by man, the men convicted of the Malmedy massacre walked out of prison. Joachim Peiper was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956. 41 years old, 11 years served. He walked out a free man. Peiper tried to rebuild a normal life. He worked for Porsche as a sales representative. He moved between cities. He kept a low profile, or tried to. His name was too well known. His past followed him wherever he went. In the early 1970s, he settled in the small village of Treves in eastern France, a quiet place near the German border, a house by the River Saône. He got a dog. He tended a garden. He worked as a translator. His neighbors knew who he was. Some said nothing. Some were uncomfortable. Some, apparently, had no strong feelings about it. Decades had passed. Europe was exhausted by its own past. But not everyone was exhausted. In 1976, 30 years after the Malmedy trial, word spread through the French press and through former resistance networks that Joachim Peiper, SS officer, commander of the unit responsible for the worst massacre of American prisoners of war in the European theater, had been living quietly in France for years. Someone sent him a letter, a warning. The letter said, "People know where you are." Peiper wrote back to a friend in Germany. The letter was found after his death. In it he wrote, "I am an ember that must be stamped out." He knew what was coming. He did not leave Treves. On the night of July 13th, 1976, the eve of Bastille Day, France's national holiday, Peiper's house was set on fire. The building burned to the ground. His body was found in the ruins. A rifle lay nearby. He had apparently tried to defend himself. No one was ever charged. An investigation was conducted. Suspects were identified: former French resistance veterans, survivors, men who had been waiting for 30 years. No one talked. No evidence stuck. The case was closed. Was it justice? That depends entirely on who you ask. The families of the 84 men shot in that field near Malmedy, most of them in their 40s and 50s by 1976, men and women who had grown up without fathers, might have one answer. The legal scholars who hold that justice administered outside a courtroom is simply not justice at all might have another. What is beyond argument is this: the system that was supposed to deliver justice had failed. Completely. Deliberately. Peiper had been sentenced to death and lived another 30 years. The men who burned that house had apparently decided that 30 years was long enough. Some things don't end with a treaty. Some reckonings just take longer. The field outside Malmedy is peaceful now. In summer it's green and quiet. There's a stone memorial there with names carved into it. Most drivers on that road don't stop. Most don't know what happened in that field on a cold December morning in 1944. The men who died there were not famous. They were not generals or decorated heroes or men whose names appear in the history books. They were forward observers and truck drivers and radio operators. Young men from small towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Virginia and Kentucky who had raised their hands because their country asked them to. Private First Class Samuel Dobbins, 20 years old, from Virginia. Private Homer Ford, 19, from Kentucky. Corporal David Lucas, 22, from Wisconsin. 84 names. 84 men who drove down a road in Belgium on a winter morning and ran, without warning, into something they could not have predicted and could not escape. The 43 survivors lived with what they had witnessed for the rest of their lives. They testified in courtrooms. They spoke at veterans' halls and in schools and on television. They made certain that no one, if they could help it, would be allowed to forget. The last surviving witness of the Malmedy massacre was a man named Theodore Paluch. He died in 2013. He was 90 years old. He had spent 70 years making sure people knew what happened in that field. 70 years. Joachim Peiper believed, in December of 1944, that if he moved fast enough and hit hard enough, the war could still be won. That one final offensive could reverse everything. That history was still open. He was wrong about the war, and he was almost right about being forgotten. Almost. If this story matters to you, if you believe these men deserve to be remembered, the most powerful thing you could do right now is share this video. History doesn't stay alive in textbooks on shelves. It stays alive in people who keep telling the story. Thank you for watching.